Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panel of speakers today. Today, we will be focusing on our AAPI youth, and specifically on the future of the AAPI community here in Pittsburgh. For each of our speakers, as I introduce you, please feel free to say a couple sentences about the organizations that you work with and the work that you do. So first, I'd like to introduce Chris Lynn, the Assistant Director of Chapters for the American Constitution Society.
Hey everyone, it's great joining you here today. As Ernest mentioned, my name is Chris Lynn. I use he, him pronouns. Born and raised in Pittsburgh, but these days I'm based out of Philly, working for the American Constitution Society, which is the country's largest network of progressive lawyers. Let's briefly mention some of the stuff I'm doing with communities here, and then we can get into that later. I'm currently a volunteer with the Community Outreach Committee of the Asian Pacific American Bar Association. I'm also helping set up a chapter in Philly for the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance. And I'm also on the AAPI Census Subcommittee from the Mayor's Office. And I be the Minority Outreach Coordinator for the Pennsylvania Young Democrats.
Wonderful. Thank you for joining us, Chris. I'd next like to introduce Don Michael Mendoza. He is the co-founder and the Executive Artistic Director for La Ti Do Productions. Don Michael?
Hi, thanks for having me. I also go by he, his pronouns. I was actually born in Washington, D.C., but I was raised in Pittsburgh. I left Pittsburgh for college. I went to American University, but I returned a year ago, almost a week ago was the anniversary. And so I'm back now in Pittsburgh, and I have several functions. So as Ernest mentioned, I am the Executive Artistic Director of La Ti Do Productions, where I produce events, concerts, cabarets, and theater in DC, New York, LA, and now Pittsburgh starting on June 8th, virtually, of course. And then in addition to that, I serve on the board of directors for the Filipino American Association of Pittsburgh, where I chair our Young Filipino Americans of Pittsburgh, or for short, our youth group. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you. Sabrina Liu is joining us from the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance. Sabrina, if you'd like to say a few things.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for having me on this panel. My name is Sabrina Yochi Liu, she, her pronouns. I'm an immigrant from Taiwan. I'm a member of the United Steelworkers Union Local 3657, and I'm also a volunteer for the Pittsburgh chapter of the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance, or APALA. APALA is a national organization of AAPI workers that focus on advancing worker, immigrant, and civil rights.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sabrina. We're also joined by a couple student leaders from the University of Pittsburgh. First, I'd like to introduce Cynthia Trong. She serves as the president of Pitt's Asian Students Alliance.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me today. My name is Cynthia Trong. I'm a rising junior at the University of Pittsburgh, majoring in chemistry. I'm from outside of Philly and traveled to Pittsburgh on the way to college. And I'm really thankful that Pitt ASA could be included in this conversation today.
Absolutely. I'd also like to introduce Lauren Yu, who is the Vice President of External Affairs for Pitt ASA.
Hi, everybody. My name is Lauren. I am really excited to be here today. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a rising senior at the University of Pittsburgh. And so as the Vice President of External Affairs for the Asian Student Alliance, my role largely involves keeping open communication and outreach with other communities on campus, as well as in the greater Pittsburgh community. In addition, I serve as the head of the API Senate at the university.
Thank you, Lauren. And I'd also like to introduce Karina Cheng, the fundraising chair for the Chinese American Student Association at Pitt.
Hi, my name is Brina Chang, and I am a rising sophomore at the University of Pittsburgh. I am on the Chinese American Student Association, or CASA's board, and I am the fundraising chair for the upcoming year. CASA is one of the umbrella organizations under the Asian Student Alliance at Pitt, and I wanted to thank OCA for reaching out to me and the Welcoming Pittsburgh team for having this event and this opportunity to be on this panel today.
Yeah, absolutely. We're glad that you all could join us. So we want to have a sort of a free-flowing panel conversation. So feel free to, join the conversation where you see fit and where you have insight. But I'd like to start off our questions with Sabrina. Sabrina, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of the challenges that specifically face AAPI workers, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Okay. So this pandemic underscores a number of systematic issues like access to healthcare, a living wage, or very basic workers' rights like paid sick leave. In our region, we have AAPI workers in sectors like hospitality, healthcare, service industries like restaurants and nail salons, and informal sectors like childcare or housekeeping. So with that, we have frontline workers and essential workers who face shortage of proper personal protective gear. And we have workers who are laid off or have heavily reduced hours and face financial stress. And for folks who are working in the informal sector, and for tip workers in restaurants or nail salons who earn only $2.83 per hour minimum wage, it was either impossible or very difficult at first for them to get unemployment benefits that would be on par with what they usually make. So in the month of May, Apollo launched a campaign called AAPIs are essential, not expandable. It's a series of videos that highlight AAPI workers who are doing essential work so that folks can stay healthy and fed. And we're also demanding more inclusive provisions in future COVID-related bills, because there are APIs in marginalized or vulnerable groups that have been left out in the current COVID relief packages, like people still in detention centers and undocumented immigrants or mixed status families who are just not eligible to receive any economic relief. So because of that, Apollo also, just a couple of weeks ago, last week, started a COVID-19 community fund that is giving out a one-time $500 relief to people in need. And some of the efforts that we do to support AAPI community members really started before this pandemic. For example, locally, we had the pleasure to partner with Governor Wolf's Commission on Asian Pacific Affairs and turn out people to phone bank and demand that Pennsylvania raise the legal minimum wage. That has been $7.25 since 2009. We also have been educating AAPI community about the importance of filling out the census so that we have the data to make sure AAPI communities have the resources we need. And with that, we had the honor of working with Pitt ASA with Lauren and Cynthia here, and had a very engaging session. It was fun. We also supported efforts led by the Restaurant Opportunity Center and Pittsburgh United to require paid sick days in Allegheny County, and continue to demand that measures like this should include provisions like front-loading the leave or raising the cap for accrued paid leave, because workers really shouldn't have to choose to come to work sick because they cannot afford to lose a day's pay. And part of what we do is also to support workers' efforts to form a labor union so that people can stand together and negotiate better working conditions with their employer, because that is one way that people can make changes happen. And during this pandemic, we're seeing workers with a union having that ability to negotiate with their employer about how they conduct their work and also health and safety protocols when they're at work. And you might think that I'm not a worker, or like unions are for people like, I don't know, steel workers or nurses. But the reality is this: in Pittsburgh, just last year, we had Carnegie Library staff members and Google's contract tech workers in Bakery Square voted to form unions so that they can improve their conditions. And this is especially relevant to the youth, because in this country, for young people aged 16 to 24, union members make 43% more than non-union members. And locally coming up, we're going to partner with the Labor Council for Latin American Advancement and Restaurant Opportunity Center, also Casa San Jose, to distribute reusable masks for restaurant workers who lack personal protective gear. And more details will come out pretty soon. So for folks who want to support the work of Apollo Pittsburgh or want to be a part of this, you can donate to or apply for Apollo's COVID-19 Community Fund. We'll have some volunteer opportunities coming up, and you can follow us on Facebook. Back to you, Ernest.
Thank you, Sabrina. And the best place to get involved with volunteering or donating to the Apollo Fund is the Facebook, or is there a link that we should direct folks to?
We can be found on Facebook as Apollo Pittsburgh, which is APALA Pittsburgh. And you can feel free to message us to figure out the best way that you can get involved.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sabrina. Now, Michael, I'd like to turn to you for a little bit. I'd like to, you do a lot of work in the arts, and I just really wanted to hear from you, the importance of AAPI representation in the arts, why you feel it's important and why it's important for the community, and if you can speak to your experience a little bit, especially here in Pittsburgh.
Sure. So I think some people in the audience might be thinking like, oh, we're talking about civic duty and the future of civics, and why is a producer on this phone call? And it is a common question, so don't feel bad if you are thinking that. But really, the arts is always somehow connected to civic duty or civic life or politics, really. Art, there's a saying that art imitates life, imitates art. And so, a lot of people use art to cope with things that are happening around them, especially right now in the pandemic. You're seeing a lot of new art being created, a lot of new ideas and things that are starting to create change and are helping people. And I don't use this word in any condescending way, but it's getting normal people to join a bigger conversation because it's getting people to express themselves. So from my point of view, being in the arts, representation has always been an issue. And I think now as an Asian American producer, specifically Filipino American, the idea of helping get proper representation for who we are as Asian Americans in your communities, wherever you live, is so, so important, especially when it's connected to racism, when it's connected to the misinterpretation of people and their culture and their ethnic identities because of hate speech or because of misinformation or fake news, even to that point. So I think in the arts, it's very important that we help support the civic leaders and help support spreading information that is correct. And from the arts perspective, people really want to get involved. I don't want to say this, but because it sounds not like a common phrase, but the arts is quote unquote less scary than if you were like, I'm going to go run for office, and I think it gets a lot of people motivated to get involved, and eventually they end up running for office, or they end up joining a union or joining a political PAC. And so the work that I do kind of helps coincide with that. And so with my company, we've always been of the mindset of helping to highlight underrepresented people, whether that be people of color, women, LGBTQ+, specifically on the transgender community. And we are focused on equity. And I think equity is important in all realms, in labor, in politics, especially in the arts. And as a producer, my job is to make sure that we are presented correctly and accurately. And so connected to this conversation about the youth of the AAPI Pittsburgh community, there are two organizations that I've gotten involved with in the last 2 months that sprang out of the misinformation and racism toward Asian Americans with COVID-19. And one of them is called Racism is a Virus. And from that sprouted another organization called Unapologetically Asian. Both are meant to spread information and education about different cultures in Asian communities, in Asian American communities. And it's also meant to be participatory. So it's not something that is just a one-way message from an organization telling people things. We want people to get involved. And especially now with the unfortunate events in the last couple of weeks with police violence, racism is a virus is now, it always has been, but it's even more so an umbrella for just racism against all people, and showing solidarity between people of color, and making sure that we as Asian Americans also help fight beside our African American brothers and sisters, and transgender brothers and sisters in the injustice that's coming toward them. So, but there's a lot of really fun things we can do to get involved and to get people to get excited about talking about their cultures, about talking about their Asian American identities. And I speak for myself, but I think it's pretty common with folks like me who are first generation Asian American children with immigrant parents. You know, our understanding of our culture gets a little lost along the way because we hear it secondhand. You know, we don't live in the country of origin that our parents came from. Or if you're an immigrant, you're far from your culture and you're kind of the representative of your race almost. And so this is a way to get people talking about who they are, what they represent, and also to help people understand that just because you see an Asian American in public, it doesn't mean they're automatically Chinese. It doesn't mean that they're going to spread COVID-19 to you. And it doesn't mean that because they're Asian, that they're the ones that started it. Because a disease comes from where it comes from. It doesn't come from a person who's creating a disease. So, but yeah, I think in terms of arts and Pittsburgh specifically speaking, there's a lot of opportunity for people to use not just these organizations, but also art like theater or concerts or virtual webinars to just talk and discuss and spread the information that is correct and to just help educate and also help heal communities, you know, from misunderstanding. Because I think there's a lot of value too in speaking with people who, you know, there is a line, you know, there are crazy people, but, you know, to speaking to people who are genuinely misinformed, you know, and it's surprising sometimes when people through something as simple as a piece of theater can learn something new.
That's wonderful. And Don, Mike, you mentioned racism is a virus and unapologetically Asian. We posted the links on the Facebook video, but just for those listening at home, if you want to just say a few words on how you can connect with either of those efforts.
Yes, so both organizations are primarily on Facebook and Instagram. Just exactly as it sounds, racism is a virus and unapologetically Asian. I know that on Instagram, the only little tidbit is on Instagram, unapologetically Asian has a little underscore at the end of the name. So don't be confused or scared if you don't find it because you're not putting the underscore at the end of the tag. But specifically to unapologetically Asian, there is a big campaign right now, especially, you know, we still have a week left in Asian Pacific American History Month. And so we've kicked off the organization with exactly what the name is, Unapologetically Asian. And it's a way you can go, and the directions are on both Instagram and Facebook. We're encouraging people of all ages, but especially young people, because we know that social media is a majority of where you live, to film a 1-minute long video that talks about what that phrase means to you. And you can even touch on COVID-19 if you'd like, and then tag the organization and use the hashtag unapologetically Asian and join the conversation. It's been a lot of fun. We've had a lot of Asian American personalities join in on the conversation. Specifically, the star of To All the Boys I've Loved was one of the most recent people to jump in on that conversation. So it's been really cool to see all of these people in the really public life look back and want to participate. So we really want everybody to be part of it too.
Thank you so much, Don Mike. Chris, so I met you a few years ago, sort of in the government political space, and I wanted to get some of your insight. You know, what do you think AAPI representation looks like in the political and government sphere at the moment? And, you know, where have you seen progress and where do you see opportunity?
So I'm going to quickly preface this by saying this is all my personal views and does not reflect my organization in case I get anyone in trouble. I think I'd start by mentioning, you know, I used to be the minority outreach coordinator for the Pennsylvania Young Democrats. And one reason why I resigned this year is because there were some proposed bylaw changes. And one of those changes was to get rid of my position and only have a African-American outreach coordinator, which unfortunately I think speaks to how far too often in Pennsylvania, when we consider race and politics, it's a black and white issue, and other minority groups are far too often ignored. It's a common complaint I've heard both in Pittsburgh and Philly, and it seems like we're starting to slowly see some progress in addressing that. There's some great young Asian American political leaders already in the state. First thing that comes to mind, Patty Kim, state rep in Harrisburg, councilperson Helen Gim in Philadelphia. KU is the director of voter protection for the Democratic Party in Pennsylvania. So we're making progress, but it's definitely slow. And I think part of the major reason why that is just often as immigrants or children of immigrants, we just don't understand what the paths are to getting more involved in politics. You know, something I think about a lot as I get older. I was like one of those political nerds in high school that we sat around at lunch talking about politics and sports. And it wasn't until my senior year in high school, it was far too late, that I realized, oh, you can intern for local officials. Like I never even imagined that that was a possibility. And you know, how can you take up space if you don't know where those spaces even exist, right? So I think part of what's incumbent on those of us that have already struggled trying to navigate the system is making sure that we are resources for the next generation so that they didn't have to feel the same struggles that we did. I mean, there's often discussion about the general lack of knowledge of our political system. And just imagine how much worse it is for those that lack language access, that lack access to the power networks, that don't even know those power networks exist in the first place. You know, one thing I was trying to do in my previous role of the party was just to get translations on our websites to address those from different communities. And if you go on the Pennsylvania Democratic website today, or the Democratic website, it's all in English. There are no other languages, which I think speaks to the difficulty that even progressive organizations have in trying to reach other communities. Yeah. It was definitely inspiring to see an Asian candidate run for president this year. I do disagree with some of his views on the model minority myth, and I have to admit his latest op-ed for the Washington Post about COVID and racism kind of made me so angry that I can start throwing my laptop across the room. But beyond that, I mean, it's just being able to see representation in that sphere is so rare that I couldn't help but feel inspired. Now, Ernest and I have a lot of mutual friends that are young, Asian, interested in politics, but it's still a very small group. It's a small group in general of people that are civically minded enough to want to be involved in politics, right? And there's so many other avenues to be involved in your communities that can understand. One thing I would highlight as a potential avenue is what's coming up soon are elections for local committee people. I'm a Democratic elected committee person in Philly, which is one very easy way for people to get involved in local politics. And it's not something that many people are even aware of. So I'll be happy to discuss that later on.
Absolutely. Thank you, Chris. And we're lucky to be joined today by 3 student leaders. In the lead up to this event, I bored them with stories of how back in the day I was part of ASA, and you know, it's just been so great to hear about some of the work that they've been doing on campus. So Cynthia, Lauren, and Karina, I'd just like to turn it over to you. Just wanted to hear a little bit about what does activism and community building look like within the API community for y'all? On campus, within your generation generally, with the Pittsburgh community more broadly. So yeah, I'd love to hear from you.
So Asian American students or Asian students at Pittsburgh account for 10% of undergrads on our campus. And as a student leader of that 10% of students, our organization aims to empower and connect to that 10%. And in terms of our community building, it's really built on inclusivity, diversity, and a lot of that can be seen in our annual events, such as like culture fair and fashion show. Lauren herself led the inception of a cultural fashion show that included cultural attire from all over Asia, South Asians, East Asians, Southeast Asians, and raised over $1,000 for the Asian American Legal Defense Fund. And also Culture Fair is another annual event where I ran it my year. And I try to include teams of Indian classical dance, Chinese Vietnamese fan dance, like young Asian hip hop. And these events and a lot of what we do to connect our community very much serves for a point of a home away from home, and also people to showcase and experience culture and friendship, and that's a part of that. But another huge part of our community, which, talking to Ernest, like as a person that witnessed the inception of like the advocacy committee in ASA, it's crazy to see how long it's gone from his time to ours. And Lauren can touch upon more what we've done as our EVP. But in terms of Pitt ASA, we aim to do a lot to impact our community as a whole. Lauren herself is head of AAPI Senate. Our outgoing Vice President of External Affairs aim to gain more recognition from the community in terms of food, and very much trailblaze the importance of food recognition and portrayal within the very company Sodexo of our university. And also we aim to support our local businesses. So we started a local restaurant fundraisers where we purchased $50 gift cards from multiple different restaurants across the Pittsburgh community. And last year we held our own ICASU mini summit where members of our community, Teresa Liv, if you're watching, this is a shout out for you. She was a past ASA board member, and she, along with CMU ASA, single-handedly brought ICASU into Pittsburgh. And ICASU stands for the East Coast Asian American Student Union. And last year they attended. They held a mini ICASU summit at Pittsburgh, which included a lot of advocacy workshops. And then the very next year, brought it to Pittsburgh, where Pitt ASA allocated for over 100 students to go and connect with thousands of other universities from all over the East Coast to talk about the importance of representation within the Asian American sphere in universities, which is absolutely phenomenal. And it's crazy to see from what Ernest has said, from the shoebox office that he experienced in his time to ASA to still a slightly smaller, larger shoebox office, but to see an actual physical evidence of a larger percentage of Asian Americans gaining actual physical space and therefore importance and political power on our campus is really, really special. And Lauren can talk about that more.
Yeah, so as Cynthia said, the AAPI community comprises, I think, 10%, you mentioned, of our entire campus community. And so 10%, it might not seem like a lot, but it's definitely not an ignorable number. And I think going into my fourth year, especially, I've kind of had the privilege of seeing this evolution of the AAPI community on our campus and seeing it grow both in numbers and also in solidarity. And that's something that's really inspiring to all of us involved in it. And so specifically within ASA, I would say towards the beginning of my college career, ASA was Asian Student Alliance was definitely a place for social gathering as well as community building, like interpersonally. And that was really amazing. But as we've gone through the years, I think especially in the past 2 years, I think Cindy can speak to that as well. But especially in the past 2 years, we've seen a huge growth in advocacy work and people's passions for furthering the API community, bringing attention to API identities and the diversity within our community. And this comes in the form of increased amount of workshops that we do. Workshops can range from discussions about very specific topics within our community to almost like breakout activities at these events. And in addition, we have like constant conversations about how we can better our community, how we can move forward, how we can help our brothers and sisters in other marginalized communities, things like that. And we've also done a lot of different collaborations with other organizations on campus, especially other Asian interest groups. And so as a whole in Pitt's campus, I think the API community has grown tremendously, especially in terms of activism and advocacy. And I think people are really starting to fight for what they want and make sure that their voices are heard. And I think that A lot of that happens, especially in our generation, through social media, and especially in this time of quarantine and isolation. Please stay home. By the way, I have seen way too many crowds on the news, and it makes me so mad. But using social media to make our voices heard and to get our messages across has been a really effective method. We've actually done a lot of collaborative work with other universities, such as the Drexel University Asian Student Association. We've attended their advocacy workshops. They've come to ours. We've had really awesome conversations about our identity, work that we've done within our community and throughout our campuses. And so yeah, that's kind of what building an AAPI community looks like on our campus.
Yeah, and Rena, if you would like to speak a little bit specifically to some of the work that you're doing with CASA.
Yes, of course. So in terms of community building for CASA, like speaking as a member of CASA, CASA's goal is to enable members of our community or of our university through community building, mentorship, and to provide more leadership and involvement opportunities beyond just being on board. In the past few years, CASA has led many cultural events such as Lunar New Year and Night Market, as well as a variety of fundraisers. Last year, we were able to raise over $1,200 for the CASA Fund Foundation, or CFF, towards We Villages, which acts to provide education opportunities for children in rural China. And just a few weeks ago, we were able to organize a fundraiser through Instagram in which CASA had the goals of supporting 2 communities that were impacted by the current pandemic. One, small local Asian American businesses, as well as members of our community that may have trouble getting food during this time. We were able to raise $455 in a span of 5 days, and we worked with Rosie Cafe in Squirrel Hill to provide meals to homebound seniors in the North Boroughs area in Pittsburgh through the Meals on Wheels program. So CASA's vision for this year is to expand our community engagement outside of our university and to the greater Pittsburgh area. We have future plans to collaborate with Carnegie Mellon's Asian American organizations, as well as to work with the Pittsburgh Chinese schools and to engage AAPI high schoolers that way. In terms of activism, like outside of CASA, again, going back to ICASU, it was probably one of the best events that I've ever gone to. And I was just really struck how students just a year or 2 older than me were able to lead and run this event from ground up. And it's just, I think ICASU is just merely the surface of what our younger AAPI community can do with activism. And I'm just really excited to see what's in store in the future. An activism project that I'm working on currently is Project Day, which is an initiative started by one of my friends and I to advocate for discussions about mental health within the Asian American APIDA community and to dispel the stigma of mental health being a taboo topic. Mental health is a topic that is generally hard to talk about in like the general population overall, and it is even more so in Asian American households. So we're trying to advocate and inform about the intersectionality between mental health and the APIDA community, as well as fundraising for the Mental Health America organization. So just wanted to close off lastly to the high schoolers and rising college first years out there who are like probably really impatient in this time since we're all quarantined. I really encourage you guys to go after what makes you passionate and to take advantage of opportunities that are offered to you, because this is a time that we have the least amount of responsibilities in life and an endless amount of resources are available to us. And so like just take advantage of that. And as cliche as it sounds, do what makes you happy and fired up, because from what I saw from this year alone, we can really make an impact on our community.
Thank you, Rena. And just to sort of share real quick, at least from my own pit experience, I remember back when I was at school, and I talked about it like forever ago, but it was about 5 years ago, 5, 6 years ago, we started, when we were there, we were starting to just fundraise just to send kids to go there. When I went to ICASU, it was a tremendous, almost life-changing experience for me. Really, you know, got me asking really important questions about my identity, what I was doing in the community, what I should be doing. And it was just, when we were planning this event, it was just wild to me that you guys have brought it to Pittsburgh. It was, and it's really heartening, especially for some of the older folks on the call to sort of, see the work that you guys are doing and see where you're taking, the next steps for our community. Really briefly, when I had first started reaching out about ASA, I had actually heard from one of our commissioners on Governor Wolf's advisory commission about some of the great work that ASA did about talking with Pitt administration about some of the challenges facing the community, specifically on campus, both international students, but also just AAPI students at Pitt generally. Would love to hear a little bit about that effort and what we were trying to achieve there, and how that's been playing out.
I think we have so many inspirational and headstrong people in Pitt ASA and beyond in a lot of our Asian interest communities. And we have so many members of our communities just straight up marching up to the chancellor and the dean, like our past president and vice president of external affairs, straight up marched up to the dean and said, can you please give us a better response to COVID right now? This is not just about the quarantine, but when COVID first started coming around, the university didn't really say much, especially how it impacts Asian American students on campus. And it just didn't very sit well with them and our board. So they marched up to the staff and said, can you please give us some time to talk to the dean? So it demanded a better response. And later that week, the dean released his own statement that was more approved to what we thought would suit our community better. And a lot of times, in terms of our administration, it's really frustrating because there's so much bureaucracy within Pitt administration, but we do tend to take things just pretty slowly as things go. Progress does happen. One goal that I personally wish in the future is just more physical space for ASA and Asian students on campus. So getting in touch with people that have power over the master plan of Pitt, if getting a building for Pitt ASA and all the membership orgs and other Asian interest organizations on campus is just a mere goal of mine. But a lot of the big things that ASA accomplished just start just like that. And other initiatives very similar are the start of a multicultural LLC, which Lauren could probably talk about more if she wishes to, because that was another passion project of starting a whole LLC, which a whole, what does it stand for? I forget. Learning, living community on campus, where it would be a whole floor, of multicultural students that chose to live there. And that is very physical, literal just floor people of us marching up to administration, be like, there are people that care about this. Please literally just give us a space to exist and coalesce with these people that care too, which is really, really cool. It's slow work, but a lot of passion and time goes behind it.
Yeah, just to reiterate some points, I think it's really important to underscore how effective working like from the bottom up in terms of administration is. And so a lot of the projects that we do as ASA involve going to more smaller organizations or offices on campus and kind of like saying, hey, here's our voice, here's our vision, let's work on this together. And so the past vice president of external affairs, he started a project with Sodexo, which is our food provider, I think Cindy mentioned this a bit earlier, but basically to kind of revamp the Lunar New Year menu, because I think before it was very basic. It wasn't really encompassing of all the cultures that celebrate Lunar New Year. And so he kind of like jump-started this recognition of Lunar New Year as a cultural holiday for the API and more communities. And that obviously works its way up to administration and just shows that we have a voice and that we matter and we want to make changes. And in addition, we're currently trying our best fingers crossed, to create an Asian American Studies certificate. And so right now the university has an Asian Studies certificate, and we have a bunch of classes involving Asian culture and things like that. But the Asian experience and the Asian American experience is arguably very different. And so, you know, working with the Asian Studies Center at Pitt and trying to establish this certificate is another way that we can like have our voices heard, work from the bottom up. And not to say that ASC, the Asian Studies Center, is the bottom at all, but just working from these smaller offices up into the administration and just kind of showing that we have a voice.
Absolutely, thank you. I'd like to turn it over to some of our older folks on the call here. We're hearing about a lot of the great work that Cynthia and Lauren and Karina are doing on campus, but you know, I'd love to hear some advice that you have, you know, based on your own experience about how the folks on this call and those listening at home can stay involved with you know, the AAPI community, with AAPI organizing, with AAPI activism beyond college. What are some avenues to that? What are some things to keep in mind? Just general advice. Sabrina, if you'd like to start.
Okay. So locally in Pittsburgh, Apollo Pittsburgh is a very, very new chapter that's only 1 year-ish old. We're a very small group of volunteers, so you can really just be a part of us and shape the work we do. And volunteering with us could mean sending text messages to make sure people are filling out census. It could mean making phone calls to get AAPIs registered to vote so that our voices are heard. It could be sharing your stories. We have stuff, like if you're somebody who will shine behind a bullhorn, we'll get you a bullhorn and get you on the street. If you love staying behind the scene, we'll have stuff for you to do, whether that's communications or planning event logistics. So there are a lot of work we could be doing locally. Nationally, Apollo has a fellowship program that places fellows across the country to work with chapters on the ground. Apollo has about 22 chapters in the country, and the fellowship work will mostly be about membership development and civic engagement work. So that ranges from voter registration, voter turnout, to canvassing for specific issues and candidates. And for folks who are just thinking about what to get involved with and what to do to broaden your activism work, I want to just talk about this real quick, that AAPIs in the United States had a long history of standing together to fight for better lives. This is from Chinese railroad workers who decided to strike for equal pay, but also dignity, to Filipino sugarcane plantation workers in Hawaii who struck for, honestly, it's racism, about racism and respect, and then better working conditions. And then to modern day AAPI domestic workers who started in New York City, fought for legislation that will guarantee wage protection. So AAPI leaders before us stood strong together, and a lot of them really built interracial alliances to fight for economic and social justice. And they had to fight because of structural problems like white supremacy or capitalism, because of those divides that were built along race and class lines. So I just want to encourage people to imagine what dignity and respect can look like where you work and where you live, and just get involved and do something about it.
Thank you, Sabrina. Don, Mike, the same question, if you have some advice for our next generation of AAPI leaders.
Sure. So you've all heard the two organizations that I've been involved with earlier, just to say it again. And actually to clarify a little bit too, racism as a virus is meant, it's not just for Asian people, or just for people of color. It's also meant for allies. If you are somebody in the audience right now who wants to just find ways to be a great ally, that's a great way to get involved. through Racism's Virus, and then Unapologetically Asian is geared specifically to the Asian American community. So, you know, to really tell our stories and to educate both within our communities and the Asian community, Asian American community, but also between our allies and ourselves. But a few other ways you can get involved, you know, in terms of allyship, speaking to my role with the Filipino American Association of Pittsburgh, kind of like really any organization, we're always looking for people to help us with our events, well, when we can all be together again, but, you know, with our events, with our marketing, with our newsletter, it's an all volunteer organization because it is a community group. It's not for profit. You know, people to teach our youth group things. So, you know, yes, it's Filipino American, but, you know, it doesn't eliminate people that aren't Filipino American from participating. And I will say the food's pretty baller. So if you like Filipino food or want to try it, we're definitely happy to feed you too. And then another way to get involved, civically speaking, kind of the way I met Ernest, is through one group that I really love and I'm deeply involved with now is called APACS, APAICS, or the Asian Pacific American Institute for Congressional Studies. Lots of words. But it's an organization that's meant to educate Asian American people in the United States how to run for office, how to get involved politically, how to speak with your representatives even, or how to just even be involved outside of running for office, whether your career is in marketing or PR or, you know, whatever field you may be in, to support a candidate or to support a party that you are part of. APACS is nonpartisan. So, you know, you can be part of any political party and be part of APACS. So yeah, there's some few ways, but in terms of advice, what really helped me, and I wish that somebody had told me this before I figured it out, you know, which was hard because I had a mentor, but, you know, for Asian Americans in business, it's hard. We don't have a lot of examples that we can follow. And so the piece of advice is always ask the question. If you have a question that you want to ask, or if there's something you're curious about, don't be afraid to ask, because the worst thing that could happen is the answer is no. And that leaves you with two choices. You can either change your trajectory to do something else, or you can ask another person who might say yes. And that applies to work, to organizations, to new ideas, whichever. And don't be afraid of that, because just because you get a no doesn't mean it's a failure. It just means it's a challenge, and you can figure out a better way to reach the goal or the dream that you're trying to make real.
Thank you, Don Mike. Chris, if you would like to speak to that question as well, advice to the next generation.
Sure, it feels weird to be as an elder, I guess, but we'll see.
We got old quick, man.
I guess two things come to mind, and I'll give sort of more broader advice beyond any particular organizations. First is to be very intentional about working with the community. So there's a reason why I'm working with the Asian Bar and not the General Bar Association, why I'm volunteering with the AAPI Census Committee, not broader census work. And I think it can be very easy when you're a professional and you're not in spaces that are often AAPI majority to lose sight of those volunteer opportunities. So that's why I personally, when I do volunteer, seek out those spaces to insert myself. And then the second piece of advice I have is, if you're in a space where there aren't many AAPI folk, for example, in politics, you know, Ernest can probably speak to us as well. If you're at any sort of political meeting, you can probably count the number of AAPI people in half a hand, maybe just one or two. I'm maybe too aggressive in introducing myself to those people and just being like, hey, you're here, I'm here. We should get to know each other, right? I mean, networking can be very daunting, but I think it's important if you're in one of those spaces where AAPI people often historically have not been in, and you do see someone else that shares those interests in delving into those spaces with you, if you're willing to overcome whatever shyness or et cetera, make that outreach to them and see if you can build those connections. Because it's really, I mean, this has been spoken about as a constant refrain today. It's about building that community and empowering each other rather than seeking any sort of personal advancement.
Absolutely. Thank you, Chris. So I wanted to ask each speaker this question and give you all a little time to really, talk about it and reflect on it. But I wanted to give you an opportunity to reflect on your Pittsburgh AAPI experience. I want to hear your thoughts about the space for folks of color here in the city of Pittsburgh, particularly those in the AAPI community. How your experience as a member of the AAPI community here in Pittsburgh has shaped your AAPI identity, and your hopes for the AAPI community here in Pittsburgh for our future. Sabrina, we'll start with you.
Okay. So I started talking to people about building this Apollo chapter about 2 years ago. And honestly, I was shocked by the overwhelming support I received. And that is from providing food, Isa, shout out to you, volunteering for logistics, donating money, creating or performing art, or providing just the experience people have, knowledge and professional consultation. And I also met so many people of color leaders in our city who are very committed to build up other people. And that to me was just amazing because as an immigrant, the AAPI's identity was something that I gradually sort of learned and identify with. And it is a group that is so diverse, right? So the solidarity I have witnessed really made me feel a sense of belonging and a sense of sort of family. In terms of the future, future hope, goals, my hope is that we can truly realize we say that we should rise together, but like, what does that mean, right? So I hope that the AAPI community will really understand that we cannot solve the problem of this uptick of anti-Asian racism and violence if we do not speak up to demand justice for George Floyd and demand that Black Lives Matter. And that we should always remember that this AAPI identity, that it really came out from the civil rights movement and the Black liberation movement. And I also hope that folks in our AAPI community can also unpack our own individual privileges and look within our community, our AAPI community, and think, who are the most visible? Who are the most marginalized people? Because I think the way that we move forward is to raise the floor, to lift up each other and also build the interracial solidarity to tackle some of the common problems that we face and build a better future.
Thank you, Sabrina. Chris, same question. Just thoughts on space for the AAPI community here in Pittsburgh, your experience as an AAPI in Pittsburgh, and how that shaped your identity, and your hopes for the future of the AAPI community in Pittsburgh.
I'll start with this. One of my favorite little factoids. Maybe favorite is not the right word. If you look at who sponsored the expansion of the Chinese Exclusion Acts, one of the leading politicians was a senator from Pittsburgh. And now here we are today talking about AAPI folk in the city. So progress is definitely possible. When I was growing up, I went to Pittsburgh public schools my entire life. I was the only Asian kid in elementary school, one of 3 in middle school, one of 5 in high school. So I guess numbers are increasing. I remember Brookings did a study of the 200 major metropolitan areas in the country. And based on the 2010 census, I think Pittsburgh was the third least diverse city in America. And today, the experience of those that are living there is so much better than what I had growing up, and it's really inspiring. It seems like, while it's slow, but there is definitely movement. Like when I was at Pitt, there really wasn't a lot of visible AAPI groups on campus. And then from Ernest to the students today, it's amazing to see how quickly that movement has grown. Sabrina mentioned, I think quite rightly, that a lot of the fight for our own civil rights and social justice is embedded in fighting with other marginalized groups as well. One thing I like to often remind those that might not be aware of our history is a lot of the racial animus that has cemented in our legal system is actually based on the racism that was directed towards Asian Americans in the past. So if you look at like Trump's travel ban, the legal precedent for that was the Chinese bans. And if you look at many of the civil rights laws and constitutional decisions, those are all directed towards what affected Asian Americans. And yet, here we are today. So really, it's the students on the call that kind of make me hopeful, because you're really leading the work and fighting the fight that we're just happy to support you.
Thank you, Chris. Don Michael, the same question. Your thoughts on the space for AAPI folks in Pittsburgh, how that experience here in Pittsburgh has shaped your AAPI identity and your hopes for the AAPI community in Pittsburgh moving forward.
Sure. Like Chris, I grew up here too, and I have to agree. It's become the progress wasn't evident in the moment, but when sitting here in 2020 and looking back at the 90s in Pittsburgh, we've come so far. Especially like school. Speaking of school, like just like Chris, I was the only Filipino in my entire K through 12 city campus, with the addition of one other student who was like a fourth grader. And we knew each other because we were like, oh my God, you're also Filipino. And so, but we didn't really hang out because the age difference was so big. But I think now Pittsburgh is becoming more diverse. And, I think one thing in terms of the space for AAPI people here in the city is that now it's available. I think we have a very special position in the community, in the fact that now the city is even more willing to listen. There are people that are willing to work with us, and there are people that want to know more. And I think it's also encouraging in terms of hopes for the future that the youth, not only young people on this call, but young people in general, are excited. They're excited to get involved. They're excited to make change. Not just politically, also in their communities, and people are doing it in all industries and all realms. Speaking of the arts of where I'm from, and I mentioned it earlier, it's not just the quarantine that's encouraging new art. I mean, you look at things like Hamilton, and you look at shows like Allegiance about Japanese internment camps, and Here Lies Love, which was about President Marcos in the Philippines. There is more of a want to understand our culture, to understand interculturalism, multiculturalism, breaking the barriers between different ethnicities and races and countries. And so I think the future lies in what we do to break stereotypes. And I think it ebbs and flows in terms of, it's always important, but it's urgency. Right now it's very urgent because people are leaning on stereotypes and it's causing misinformation and hate. And so I think the more we can work together, the more we can get involved to really get out there and educate on both ends, from people that have been around for longer, or people who are just getting out into the quote unquote real world, or people that are still in school, just educating their campuses. As long as we're all making an effort, we can sit here 20 years from now and look back at Pittsburgh and be like, wow, look at all the change that's happened in that time. Because it's very easy to, and especially for people of color, it's very easy to lose hope. Our space can be very dark very fast. And so it's just that constant communication and constant want to get involved, even in the worst times, that will really help. And I think it's our younger generation and their motivation to get involved and do that that really gives me hope for what's next.
Thank you, Don Mike. I'd like to turn it over to our college students, starting with Cynthia, followed by Lauren, and then Rena. If you could each tell us a little bit about your Pittsburgh AAPI experience. Speak for AAPIs here in Pittsburgh, how your experience as an AAPI in Pittsburgh has shaped your identity as an AAPI more broadly, and your hopes for the AAPI community here in Pittsburgh as we move to the future.
Yeah, so I hail from white suburbia, much like a lot of students I know at school. but I also come from a really large Chinese Vietnamese immigrant family. Quite literally, my mother is one of 10 siblings, and I have 6 million cousins. And I was always very, very secure in my Asian identity and then in my identity as an American teenager. And that is how I led my life until I came to college at the University of Pittsburgh. And I realized being Asian American lives in every single corner of my life, and those two things could not be separated. And I lived for so long being an American teen. I went to school. I knew I wanted to go into STEM. And then my cultural self at home, one that took care of my grandmother and like cooks Vietnamese and Chinese food all the time. And coming to college, I realized how those two things, when put together, just really defined my life and how much I had to take control of that and let that empower me in what I do. And that led me to become a student leader of an organization that very much helped me find that very like that non-cultural Asian American identity, that side of me. And what I hope for in the future in terms of university sake, speaking as a college student, is I want the University of Pittsburgh to recognize Asians and empower us outside of our small orgs. I think that the university gives ASA and other student orgs a lot of power, and a lot of the Asian offices like the Asian Studies Center a lot of power, but they themselves don't really acknowledge us. I don't see an email from Chancellor Gallagher acknowledging AAPI month at all. It was sort of just put up to us, which is great. But I think it's time for the university, instead of squaring us away in our own little bubble, acknowledge our presence on campus on a larger scale in terms of just acknowledgement, monetarily, but also in terms of outside the university. Everyone on this call has mentioned how we as college students has inspired you all and really motivates and heartwarms you. And I would say the vice versa very much exists. And what Lauren's vision very much exists for is for our undergrad organization to outreach to Pittsburgh and adults like you who are extremely inspiring, because I think Pittsburgh, University of Pittsburgh, it's a research school, it's a STEM school, and a lot of Asian Americans that go there are very much stuck within the model minority, more so than other, like my friends at other universities. And it's because we very much is the inherent nature of our university, and I understand that. But I see too many young, confused Asian students just say they want to be pre-med, and they don't exactly know why. And it's because it's model minority, it's just festered. But to see adults, and in one of ASA's goals is to connect with adults like Sabrina. We brought up Paula to our university, and just to showcase that there's so many other things in life that you can do, and to see successful adults, especially like Don with his own production company. That's what I want to ASA to continue to do within the greater Pittsburgh community, to reach out to like mid-successful to successful Asian American adults in our community and show them the possibilities and the end result. And that's really, really inspiring, I think, for us as college students. So I just say that same sentiment is very much returned.
Yeah, I agree 100%. The work that you all have done in paving the way for us, undergrads, babies, if you will, it's been really inspiring. And even just hearing more about it right now has made me, and I'm sure the rest of us, very motivated to get in contact with you and to speak more with you about like other opportunities and things that you've done. And so thank you very much for inspiring us. As far as my API identity, I have a very similar story to Cynthia. I grew up in a predominantly white suburban town. And so the Asian side of my identity wasn't really developed. I kind of got involved in activism a little early, but it wasn't revolving around my specific Asian identity. And then when I came to Pitt, I was like, oh my gosh, there are a bunch of different people here. This is really diverse compared to my old town. But obviously, as I became accustomed to it, I kind of realized that it was still kind of lacking in a way, in that we do have a large AAPI presence within our universities and the university towns and whatnot, but I think within the greater Pittsburgh area, we don't see as much representation. And I've kind of seen that when I can leave campus, which is unfortunately kind of rarely. I have seen that we don't have as much representation outside of universities. But what I do notice when I leave campus are definitely like gentrification and like large physical separation of socioeconomic statuses and barriers and things like that. And so that's also something that kind of jars me, and is something that I think we all within our API community need to be aware of, because it's even more reason for us to ally with our fellow communities of color, and especially those who are unable to access resources and within those lower socioeconomic standing communities. I think we are all aware that the coronavirus impacts and targets communities of color significantly more than other communities, and that's even more reason for Black communities, brown communities, the API community to band together and to make sure that we are progressing forward and have a common goal. And so as a whole, being in Pittsburgh has really shown me that both this allyship aspect of our identities, as well as like the specific Asian identity to me is really important, and developing that is really important. And so that's kind of just been my evolution with my identity.
Thank you, Lauren. Rena?
Yeah. So I also grew up in a predominantly white community, as many of our speakers on our panel. I grew up near Scranton, Pennsylvania, and though I didn't like face any explicit racism in any sense, but I could definitely see there's differences between like my family and my friend's family, like stereotypical taking off your shoes before entering the house, or like having like the quote unquote lunchbox moment when you see the cultural differences between the Asian food that your mom packed for you compared to your friends' lunches. So I definitely felt like I didn't completely fit in. It wasn't until I heard other Asian American stories coming to college through like cultural organizations like ASA, CASA, and going to ICASU that I realized that I actually had a very typical Asian American upbringing, and that my cultural background isn't something that I have to hide, but rather something that I can embrace. I also realized that I don't have to like face these things alone, because through like stories and voices I saw and heard through places like subtle Asian traits and within my friend group, it was a very eye-opening experience coming to college and being able to be proud of my culture and not to have to hide it. So my hope for the future of our API community in Pittsburgh is for there to be a continual upward trend in AIPA engagement and activism in the community. And then along with the lines of what Sabrina and Chris mentioned earlier, one thing that inspired me during this pandemic was seeing different communities of color coming together to fight against racism and to advocate together, because you can definitely see that there's a lot that you can do when a bunch of communities, groups of individuals come together that have similar goals and interests, and they like fight for the same cause. So I have really big hopes for the variety of cultural and racial communities of Pittsburgh to form connections now and in the future.
Thank you, Rena. So as we start to wrap up, I want to take a moment to thank Etha Cow, who is obviously on this call. At the beginning of the month, we sort of came together and wanted to find a way for the city to meaningfully, reach out to our AAPI community, especially in the time of COVID-19 and the pandemic, and just different types of struggles that the community is facing during these times. And when we started out with this whole series event, we really wanted to give folks a platform to be heard, allow different aspects of our community to be heard and showcased. And we've been heartened by the outreach, but I do want to take this moment to let Issa sort of talk her piece as well. She and I both come from Central Pennsylvania, so it's a very specific experience being an Asian American out there. And Yeah, I would love to give you this opportunity to talk a little bit about your AAPI experience here in Pittsburgh, how that's shaped your identity, and what your hopes are for our community as we move forward.
Thanks, Ernest. And thank you all panelists. It's been so inspiring to hear your stories, especially from the younger folk, making me feel very old. But I am very inspired by the work that you're doing at Pitt. So like Ernest mentioned, I am from Central PA, and oftentimes I was the only person of any color in a room. So I think moving to Pittsburgh was very eye-opening for me because it was the first time I'd ever been in a city, with high rises, big buildings, more people than cows. I like to joke. But I think, really my AAPI experience has been shaped in Pittsburgh, especially when I was in grad school at GISBIA. I got involved with the international student group, but being an Asian American, I think Lauren and Cynthia, you've spoken to it. It is a totally different experience. And I think it's really great that you're advocating for an Asian American certificate, because I got the Asian Studies certificate, but it's a little bit more about learning about the culture and history, and less about, the identity of being who we are in this country as Americans. For sure, I think definitely working in the mayor's office for a couple of years really opened my eyes to, the racial issues and inequities in Pittsburgh. And honestly, as a person who was working often in historically Black communities and white communities, people were confused by me. It was the usual, like, do you speak English? Like, do you understand me? Why are you here, right? Why are you in my neighborhood? And why do you care specifically? So I think, growing up in Central PA, it's always been the solidarity piece. It's always been allyship. So I think, it is really challenging because you do kind of have to prove yourself with every single new person that you meet. But I think that really has shaped my identity in Pittsburgh, as well as reaching out to mentors. I have to shout out to Marian Lian. She actually reached out to me and made time. I think it's also important now, as we see ourselves getting a little bit older, to reach back out to younger folks and offer our time, right? I think we never have to lose sight of the fact that, we've been there. And I think especially something that I try to do now, especially now that I'm kind of more entrenched in the Asian professional scene, is to listen, is to learn constantly about the history of AAPIs, about the history of race and segregation in the US, and how that's impacted people who look like me, people who don't look like me, but then also to separately support other Asian people in their arts efforts, in their businesses. I think in Pittsburgh, in the past 7 years I've been here, I've been able to really see the restaurant business flourish, and I'm definitely biased because, growing up, I didn't get the opportunity to see many role models on television, and it's pretty cool now to see people who look like me on TV. But, like, as a person who honestly was not a strong student ever, and will never be, I didn't really see a career for myself in pre-med in, the engineering, the STEM. But what I did see was Bruce Lee, Jackie Chan, and I also saw Chef Martin Yan, right? So I was like, okay, maybe I could choose these career paths instead. So I did the college thing, right? Struggled, got through it, and I, started to be a cook. So I was a chef in a restaurant, and I taught martial arts in the evening. I have to say, I was one of the few women in the entire kitchen, in the entire martial arts studio. But, I think that good work ethic, but also, constantly having that battle of trying to prove myself, not just to others, but also to myself. I think that is a piece that a lot of people talk about. And Rena, I'm really inspired by the work that you do talking about the mental health piece, because that's not something that, anyone likes to talk about, but it's so important. And I think especially, having that background in, martial arts, but also food, and moving to Pittsburgh, I could see the impact that I could have as sometimes the only person of color or the person who is of API descent in the room to make an impact, because there is power too in being the big fish in the little pond. So I had the opportunity, in addition to working in the mayor's office, to starting my own food business, The Hungry Cow, because my last name is Cow. That was Facebook sourced, so all you younger people can have fun with that. But really, I saw power too in terms of education, because food often is racialized and used as a weapon against people, right? If you put down people's food, street meat, dog, etc., that automatically transfers to this group of people is also bad, they're dirty, right, etc. So really my mission started out as education, teaching cooking classes, but then I also saw an opportunity with street markets, kind of like the Lunar New Year market, that Marion definitely opened the doors for me to, sell the food, but then also to donate the proceeds intersectionally. So, definitely thinking about efforts like the Antoine Rose unfortunate incident that happened to Apala, that Sabrina hosted the Lunar New Year event last year now, I guess. But I think especially being a small business owner, where the food that I cook is not my sole income, I have that privilege and I have that opportunity to put my money and my time where I think it matters. But yeah, I think, shaping my identity for sure, that's been in Pittsburgh. I've been here for a while now, and I think I'll be here for a while yet. But definitely the hope for the future of the AAPI community. I am so inspired by the work that all of you young people do in college. I was only involved in Penn State's cultural CASA, the singing and the dancing, but also, thinking about how that can be some sort of a civil rights movement, so to speak. But also, yeah, I think it's very important to be civically engaged. And it is really cool to see interns of mine who are of API descent pursue careers that are not, traditionally the model minority stereotypes careers, because I think representation absolutely matters. I think all of us have been saying that over and over again, but having lived that experience, it's absolutely true. And also I think ways to be engaged, like join nonprofit boards. Oftentimes, I am the only Asian or East Asian person in the room, and I say it. And I don't think it needs to be accusatory, but it is a fact. And I think also, honestly, pressuring some of my other Asian friends to also join me. That's the way that we can impact change, but that's also how I see hope for the future.
Thank you, Etha. Before I wrap this up, just a couple quick public service announcements. First, the census is happening. Please, please, please fill out information for the census. We need to make sure that our communities are represented, and that's not just the API community, that's Pittsburgh, that's Pennsylvania, it's very important. You can find out more at census.gov. The second is the City of Pittsburgh's Gender Equity Commission is doing a youth listening tour. So we would love to make sure that the youth that they're listening to are representatives. Please feel free to reach out to Gender Equity at pittsburghpa.gov for more information. But once again, I'd like to thank our speakers for joining us today. I'd like to thank the folks at Welcoming Pittsburgh and Governor Wolf's Commission, Advisory Commission on Asian Pacific American Affairs for co-hosting this. And we've really appreciated getting to have these community conversations over this past month and really celebrate the diversity of the API community, in our stories and our experiences, and today and our future. There's no better feeling than the cavalry's coming, and I'm feeling really inspired after tonight. So thank you all. Really appreciate you taking the time, and thank you for joining us from home.